This ESPN podcast is brought to you by Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on car insurance. Visit geico.com.
The BS Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects. The BS Report. The BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the BS Report, taping this on a Friday. I posted a big column on Greatland.com Thursday about the action hero movie championship belt, which dates back to 1968. Solicited input from a lot of people, including Grantland's own Wesley Morris, who is on the line right now. We're on a slight delay for some reason. We cannot figure it out. Technical difficulties. We're going to press on. He's hearing me like a second late. So there's going to be like weird, awkward pauses, like we're on a bad date. But really, the reality is he's hearing me.
We love each other.
I think we can pull this off. So the biggest, I'm just going to go through the biggest complaints. I took a quick perusal through the reader emails, and the biggest complaint, it seems, is that I did not have Russell Crowe 2000 Gladiator. I did not have that over fast, the Gone in 60 Seconds Nick Cage movie. And I didn't even mention Russell Crowe at all. Do you feel like that was an omission?
I don't think it was an omission. I think you probably could have. I mean, the problem with this belt situation is that it's so comprehensive that anybody who doesn't get mentioned is going to cause someone else to ding you, right? So I would say that Russell Crowe in 2000 is something that we can talk about, but it wasn't as though it didn't launch him into some new place. And it also, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it was an omission. I just think that you probably could have mentioned it, but I mean, I sent you a list of people that I thought you should have mentioned. Like everybody's got somebody that they think should have been on this list in some capacity, but I don't think not mentioning Russell Crowe, I don't think he had the 2000 belt. If the argument is that he was your 2000 winner, I don't know if I buy that.
Yeah, I should have mentioned him. I guess the thing is, Maximus was such a great character. You could argue by the definition of what the belt was, which was, I admittedly was a little convoluted, but in terms of ass kickingness and just memorable, and you could feel like this guy could fight anybody. He's definitely in the mix. I'm okay with the Nick Cage 4-year run though. Like I do feel like I could have mentioned Russell Crowe.
That's legit.
Oh, you're not okay. Okay.
Winner.
Nick Cage.
Yes. Hands down.
Okay. So here's the next point people made, which I thought was really interesting, and I didn't even think about this because we're crossing genres here. Some people were saying when I was struggling to figure out who, in the mid 2000s, basically post Vin Diesel all the way through Liam Neeson, and you're just grasping for straws with all these different guys. Some people were saying, I blew it. Jack Bauer. I should have gone into TV and grabbed Jack Bauer from TV, and he should have been the action hero movie championship belt because Jack Bauer was the premier ass kicker of that stretch. What do you think of that?
I think that is a really interesting observation because Jack Bauer is basically the bridge between the end of one kind of action hero, that like the sort of Bruce Willis, Stallone, super patriot, Willis is sort of a different version of that. But I mean, they're all these sort of like very American, very sort of for America types of action heroes. And then you have Jack Bauer, who is a sort of government figure for one thing. And the void that he fills transitions you into this other type of action hero that is disqualified from the belt championship because those guys are played by serious actors who are playing roles as opposed to playing, a type. But it's how you get your Jason Bournes and your action hero is sort of questioning the very foundations upon which our original action hero, or that second wave action hero in the 1980s came along. I mean, it's a smart observation, but I don't think it actually leads to anybody who gets the belt after him, though, right? Except maybe Neeson, but not even Neeson. Because Neeson, that character, all of those characters are sort of not official. They're not too high up in the government, and they're not lackeys, but they're not a Jack Bauer kind of CIA person either.
Well, here's how I could have rigged it, potentially. If you argue that Jack Bauer is eligible, 24 started November 6, 2001.
Right.
So that takes us after Fast and Furious, and actually I think after Knockaround Guys too, which is what are the first two Vin Diesel movies. So I could have stripped Vin Diesel for 2004, for XXX in 2002. Could have given it to Jack Bauer in 01 and 02 for the first 2 years of 24. Then Uma Thurman in 03 for Kill Bill. Gone to Denzel and Man on Fire 2004. Then gone back to Jack Bauer because 24 had a little bit of a resurgence in 05, 06, 07. And then that would have carried me to Liam Neeson. I think I like this idea better than what I had.
I think, I don't know, you can't discount Statham. That's a real belt winner.
Yeah.
I mean, look, that first Transporter movie is, I mean, not since Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan has a guy, or in his stunt double, if indeed he didn't do it alone. But there are some sequences in that movie that are they're just mind blowing. Transporter 2, same thing. I don't know. The thing with a great action movie to me, and this is sort of one of, I mean, you know, it's not the only thing, but I think that there's got to be a how did they do that sort of thing. And I think Statham is one of the only guys who ever had a belt where I don't know how they did it. I don't know how he was able to be that suave and that not action looking. I mean, he looks like he might be a bouncer or something like that, but not in the way that Vin Diesel does. But there are some sequences in that movie that have nothing to do with his attitude. They have everything to do with just his physicality, and he's got a dancerly quality to him when he fights, and I love that about Jason Statham. So
you're saying Jason Statham potentially could have gotten the belt in 2002 right after Vin Diesel. I could have gone that way.
Oh, yeah, but that movie wasn't as big a hit as the second one.
See, I feel like part of this is thinking about it retroactively is so tough because like in my first and second drafts, I think I wrote like 8 drafts of this column. The first, second drafts, I had Swayze with the 1989 belt. And then a couple people pointed out, like, look, nobody saw Roadhouse in the theater. You can't give Swayze the belt in 1989 when that movie really didn't take off until it started making its VHS cable run. Right. And then I thought about it and I was like, oh yeah, you know who else didn't see that movie in the theater? Me. I rented it. So, you know, that should count for something. And I do think what I tried to capture with the belt was the in the moment aspect of it. Like, you know, Die Hard 2, history probably isn't that kind to it, but in the moment, when Die Hard 2 came out, that was probably the biggest movie event of 1990.
I was so excited to see that.
That has to be reflected in some way.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you did the right thing. You can't do a retroactive list. I mean, adjusting for inflation in some ways is okay, but like changing the sort of the nature of what actually happened in a given year is not. There's no point. I mean, the whole point of the list is to sort of do a snapshot of what was going on in that year.
Right. Okay. So we agree on that. And then 2 other movies that people pointed out, which I thought were interesting. One was Aliens in 1986, which I didn't even mention. I probably should have as an honorable mention. I can't put Sigourney Weaver over Stallone during the Cobra era, though. I mean, I just think that's ridiculous. But I think she should have been at least mentioned as a challenger. You wouldn't have given her the belt, right?
In 86? I mean...
Over Cobra and Stallone.
That's a tough one. I mean, it's funny because when I read this, I kind of wasn't looking for blind spots. I wasn't looking to push back against it. I mean, I think that the thing about Sigourney Weaver in Aliens is I don't think she wins the belt because I don't think that movie captured. It wasn't the sort of. I mean, it was a big hit, and I think that there was a way in which Ellen Ripley. I don't know. I mean, I can't argue about whether she should have won. I mean, if you had just given it to her, I would have had no problem with that. But I also see the thing about
Actually, I screwed up. Hold on, I screwed up because Cobra came out before Aliens. So really, I could have had Cobra, 2 Aliens, not given it to Schwarzenegger for Raw Deal in 1986, and just waited until Predator in 1987. If I want to do the Weaver thing, I feel like she's not breaking into the Sly Arnold. At that point in the mid 80s, I just don't see it.
The other thing you have to remember is this. You made it pretty clear about what the parameters were for this list, right? The parameters, I mean, you wrote off a lot of people who could have had the belt at any given moment because they didn't fit I would say somewhat fair parameters. It would be easy to give Matt Damon the belt in the years there was a Bourne movie, for instance. But, I mean, he's Matt Damon acting a part, and I feel like Sigourney Weaver is another one of those. I mean, Sigourney Weaver in 1986 she wasn't an action star. She was an actress in a part that she happened to do an amazing ass-kicking job with. But it wasn't as though she left that. I agree. This is the Russell Crowe problem, too.
That's a great point. Yeah, you just talked me out of it. Now I don't feel bad. The one I might have missed, though, which was a really good movie, and I just forgot about it, was in 1999, Mel Gibson in Payback. I don't know if it earned him the belt, but should have been mentioned as a challenger. And it's a great Mel Gibson just kicking everybody's ass performance.
Yes, it's true, but I don't think it wasn't a hit, and I don't think anybody was. I mean, we had given up on him at that point. We were over him. He had so thoroughly exasperated us. But I mean, in the scheme of things, I mean, because what we're talking about are also two different things, right? We're talking about, I mean, what you're talking about is a very specific thing. You were talking about people who were the action stars, not culturally and bankability wise, they were the action stars of their moment. And there's a sort of ancillary, not even ancillary, there's an equally interesting question that comes out of a project like this, which is, who are our great action stars? And I think that there's a lot of overlap between those two things, but I think they are separate types of arguments that you'd make in each category, right? Or in each case.
Right. So I sketched out the rules I had were in case you haven't read the column yet. Rule number 1, over everything else, I need to believe our hero can kick everyone's ass in any conceivable situation at any given time. And he needs to believe this too. Rule number 2, during our hero's apex, I would have seen his action movie no matter what the plot was and no matter how lukewarm the reviews were. And then the third one is the body of work from particular. Yeah, but the thing is, I really like Proof of Life. I'm probably in the minority, but I think Proof of Life was like the outcome of Gladiator, where it's like, oh, Russell Crowe's in a movie where he's going to kill people, I'm in. So I do think, like, to some extent that was true. And then rule number 3, the body of work from a particular run matters more than a single movie. And one I thought of after this column went up that I think is interesting, because some people were arguing for the Bond movie, and especially Connery. And even John Skipper, who runs ESPN, who read this column, said that he thought it should have started in 1962 with Connery. And my counter to that is this. Connery, he was awesome as Bond. But if you think about it, like, could you have played different parts? Like, could he have played the bouncer in Roadhouse? Could he have played Stallone's part in Cobra? Could he have played the robot in Terminator? I need some flexibility with my great action heroes. And I feel like he's Sean Connery. I don't know if he has that flexibility. What do you think?
Well, this is an interesting question. I mean, because you begin it with Steve McQueen, who I don't think of as being a terribly dynamic actor. You know what I mean? I think the thing that what's the case you would make for McQueen being somehow different from Connery in that regard?
My case would be this. Well, because first of all, I needed some sort of start for the modern action hero. So Bullet is a really good start, because that's the first movie that came out in the 60s where you feel like that movie could have just come out now. Even when you watch it on YouTube, it's dated as hell, but it feels like a modern movie.
It comes out once a year.
For whatever reason. Right. It's just re-released every year with a different title, a different actor. But I do think he did reach the point during that era, and I was barely alive then. I was a baby. But where they could have put him in anything and people would have gone to see it. And he had bought that currency with the audience that, oh no, Steve McQueen's involved. It's going to be okay. He's going to save this. Don't worry about those bad guys. Steve McQueen's involved. And even if what was he, like 5'10", he was probably 180 pounds. There was something cool about him and the way he carried himself. And so it's almost like maybe he doesn't totally make sense, but whatever he was doing worked.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I also think it's important to reiterate you didn't make this a rule, but I mean, it's another parameter that's important for the way that we are thinking about this. And it really cuts out a lot of the BS. And I think this is why Jack Bauer is such an interesting sort of side choice, and it explains like why things were so grim for that period in the 2000s. And you say this, I'm going to read what you wrote. McQueen changed everything in 68 with Frank Bullitt, a renegade San Francisco cop who, wait for it, played by his own rules, 12,000 exclamation points. Check out the poster for Bullitt and tell me this movie couldn't be remade right now with Mark Wahlberg. I think the plays by his own rules thing is kind of, you can mock it, but it's a real thing. You have to believe the thing about all these action stars is that they're playing people who are outside society's limits. Seagal was the sort of ultimate parody of this. I mean, his movie's like above the law. I mean, it's too much. But I mean, these guys
right.
are doing what they want to do. And the thing that made Eastwood such a great star was he was even morally wrong in his sort of like renegade conservative cop shtick. But that was exciting because, people were cheering for him to clean up the streets. And the playing by your own rules thing is what the draw was with all these guys.
It's a great one. I mean, it certainly explained a lot of people's careers. And I think Liam Neeson was the first guy in the last, I don't know, you'd have to go back to the mid-90s, was the first guy who really grabbed that playing by my own rules corner. For some reason, Hollywood just stopped making movies like that. And I initially had written a much bigger section about this, and I just cut it down because the column was too long. But it is really interesting to see what happened to action movies. What is your theory? You look at the heyday, which is basically from 84 to 96, where all types of movies, you had the Seagal, Van Damme, all these guys, plus you had Stallone and Arnold, but then you also had the Die Hard, and then everybody trying to rip off Die Hard, but then you also had The Fugitive. It was just this glory stretch of action movies, and then it kind of petered out. And my theory was that, just from the kind of movies Hollywood was trying to make, they were going for the expensive ones and comic books and CGI and big disaster movies. And then on top of it was a talent deficiency. What do you think the reasons were that that whole genre just kind of petered out a little bit?
I think there are a couple things that happened. I think the first thing is that, in the heyday or when the action movie was a new thing. And as we know it now, I mean, when Eastwood and Stallone and Schwarzenegger were stars, the thing that they were starring in movies made by American directors who had something to say about the country, right? They sensed that something was off, and even Mel Gibson to some extent was like this. They were working with American directors. These movies were made by American directors who really wanted to argue something about this country. The country was sliding off the rails. The moral balance had gotten out of whack. Women were threatening to become equal. Black people were asking for their rights. There was a real sense that the country was going crazy, and that it had whatever was going crazy, and it had to be stopped. It's how you had this alternative universe in blaxploitation movies where everything that the Eastwood characters were sort of fighting for, the blaxploitation stars were fighting to uphold. A really good Marvel universe movie would have definitely had, Dirty Harry versus Foxy Brown. That would have been, that's the sort of thing, or Dirty Harry versus Shaft. And I think that the politics of these movies they're really interesting. And I'm saying this as a person who finds some of the politics really appalling. But there's a sense in which these movies had a real determination to tell audiences what was wrong with America, and then to offer a solution to that problem in the form of a hero. And that is true all the way up until, I think, the Die Hard movies. And you had this, and Schwarzenegger's an interesting action star, right? Because he came from another place. He's an Austrian. But he really identified with America. And so you also have this immigrant who is sort of fighting on behalf of the United States as a super patriot in movie after movie. And I think at some point, the American directors stopped making action movies. The Luc Bessons of the world start writing and bringing in these directors to make them. And the whole balance sort of shifts. And I think Bruce Willis is one of the pivotal figures in that, too, because he stops working. He starts working with everybody. The American directors, the French, he works with Besson. And now in 2013, and sort of beginning, and maybe with the arrival of Guillermo del Toro, you have this shift where you have these guys who weren't necessarily born in this country, but have watched these movies. They've watched all the great action movies, but they want to make these movies, but they have no real connection to the politics in them. So they somehow become apolitical. And I think the audience is now, I don't know if we really are responding. I don't know if Dirty Harry would necessarily be a hit now, but I think the story that it would be telling about America would be we're not telling a story about America now, because these movies are trying to play to China and Japan and Germany and Russia and Indonesia. You now are trying to serve a global audience. And I think that's been the shift. So anybody who seems credible and can kick ass in a movie has a chance of being an action star. And there are fewer and fewer Americans who want to do that. And I think this sort of goes to the other thing that I've observed, which is that you just don't have enough actors who have the masculine gumption that, or, they don't have the balls to be a Clint Eastwood or a Dirty Harry, because now there's something kind of embarrassing about being an American. And that became true during the Bush era. And I think the Bush era, which obviously began in 2000, the Bush era changed things. I think it changed the way we felt about this country. I think it changed the way certain people, particularly the people who make our movies, in Hollywood, feel about our representation in around the world. And I think that the movies began to advertise different things. And so you had a Ben Affleck who really probably could have been an action hero, kind of going the other way and kind of not wanting to have anything to do with even being a movie star in a conventional way. And so, I think that that was a huge shift. It was a huge shift ultimately, but a very subtle one that became truer and truer. We're now in this moment where we don't really have, there's maybe one American guy who's a credible heir to the throne. You got to remember, Liam Neeson he's an Irishman working with French directors in movie after movie, and Spaniards. So, it's not, the Americanness of the action movie is no longer has any currency.
So you're saying in the 70s, these action heroes kind of came about partly because America was so rudderless and all this stuff and all chaos and political protest, everything. And then somebody like Dirty Harry comes in and it's like, oh, now here's somebody we can trust. And then that spreads to the mid-70s with, oh, we have all this crime now. Oh, there's Charles Bronson. He's going to kill the vigilantes. Then it goes into the late 70s and we have all those Vietnam guilt movies and all this, and that leads to Missing in Action and First Blood. And it takes us into the American superhero, which is Stallone and Arnold as we're in the Cold War. And thank God we have this one guy for America who's going to fight for us. And goes all the way through to Bruce Willis. Then they spend 7 years ripping off Die Hard. But now we're in the late 90s. And now what are we trying to say? I think I agree with you.
I mean, it's just too much.
And then that leads to a 4-year run for Nick Cage.
Mm-hmm. Where you have these, they're cartoons basically. The Cage era, I mean, none of those movies, I mean, even the Michael Bay ones, I mean, most of those movies that Cage made were produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, and the politics of them is sort of hilarious in a lot of ways, because they're not working with a realist politics, right? They're not working with, they're not responding to what's in the news. They're responding to the movies that came before them. They are turning into this, in this very broad way, the sort of most fantastical ideas about America into, these big explosive action spectacles. And that wasn't the case in the 70s and 80s. I mean, those movies were also ridiculous, but they were ridiculous in these very sort of understandable, like, life-size terms.
Mm. So, couple other points I wanted to make here that I wanted to get your take on. You're okay with Denzel in 2004? Man, I
hate that movie. I don't know how you can like it, but I can't argue against it. I can't argue against him getting the belt in 2004. I hate that movie. I mean, it is.
You hate that movie. This is our all-time biggest disagreement we've ever had.
I mean, I didn't even know where to start with. I mean, look, I was not a big Tony Scott person. I thought he had his moments. I think he and Denzel worked well together. But there's something just kind of appalling about that movie. I mean, it is plays by his own rules on steroids, crack, and any antipsychotic drug that isn't working for it. I don't know. I mean, he gets the belt in 2004. He could get the belt in other years too. I mean, he's definitely a contender from maybe 2004 on. I mean, Book of Eli, which is another bad movie, but that was a hit. People want to see Denzel Washington be Denzel. They really do. I mean, they'll take him acting. I don't think people mind seeing him. I mean, Flight was a kind of big hit, but I think people really like Denzel in a pair of sunglasses, kind of being unkillable. I mean, that's what Safe House was about. I mean, he was actually really good in that terrible movie. And, when you put him alongside a guy like Ryan Reynolds, you really understand, A, what a movie star is, and also in some way what an action hero is. And it's not Ryan Reynolds.
Yeah. Denzel, out of all the A-listers, it's him and Bruce Willis were the two that figured out how to be A-listers and appear in all different types of movie while also dabbling into the awesome action hero genre. Those were, I think, I'm trying to think, is there anybody else who was able to do that so effortlessly? I mean,
Stallone tried.
I guess he really tried really, really, really hard. You're not a wrestling fan, but a couple people mentioned that an interesting way to have done the championship belt would have been to have the championship belt, but then also in wrestling they call it the Intercontinental belt, which is like kind of for, it's not the championship belt, but it's another belt for kind of like the guys on the next level down. And that would have been a really fun way to do Chuck Norris and Van Damme and all those people. Yeah, what can you tell me?
I am insanely familiar with the Intercontinental belt.
Okay, good.
This is probably a conversation for a different conversation, but I'm familiar.
I didn't realize you were a wrestling fan. So if we'd had the Intercontinental belt, that would have been fun, because then you can work in Jet Li and, early Statham and people like that. Like Swayze definitely wins in 1989 for Roadhouse. So that becomes a whole other belt.
Total
I'm not going to write that column, but it would have been incredible. Charles Bronson has a 7-year run. Did you think Bronson should have won the belt?
not during that era. I mean, there was just too much going on. I mean, by the 80s, yeah, when you were in that transitional moment, sure. But I mean, it's the same thing. I argue the same thing with Bronson. I mean, it's not like, I mean, Bronson was a much bigger deal than Norris was, you know, at Bronson's peak.
Yep.
He was a much bigger deal than Chuck Norris. But, you know, and Chuck Norris is sort of I mean, none of those movies were tremendous hits. I mean, they weren't bombs at all. But I mean, I think that, you know, there wasn't a lot happening in the early 80s, and you had, you know, the action sort of had been turned, it had gone in this other direction into a slightly more mainstream kind of movie. I mean, you had Indiana Jones came along in the early 80s. And I think that the arrival of that movie sort of changed a little bit how other action movies might have worked. And I think, you know, and this was also just about the time at which Stallone began to do the Rambo thing. I don't know. I mean, Norris is an interesting guy. I mean, he definitely goes in that other category of just great action stars, but he wasn't, I don't think he quite captured, he was somewhere between that Dirty Harry, but, you know, he was somewhere between Harry Callahan and John Rambo, right? I mean, he was cleaning up something, but he was also sort of trying to correct at the same time. You know, he was going in and pulling people out. He was rescuing, but he wasn't moralizing necessarily. I think that he just served a slightly amoral purpose that is different from what Rambo and Callahan were doing.
That was interesting because I asked you about Bronson, but you thought I said Norris, but I was going to ask you about Norris after Bronson, so you answered my question out of order. But now I don't have to ask you about Chuck Norris. But well, yeah, because Bronson, I think, out of anyone who didn't win the belt in this column, the best two careers were Bronson and Seagal. Like Seagal really, arguably, should have won the belt at some point, and he had good movies. He had a really, really nice 6-year run. I mean, he made 6 movies that I would watch right now if they were on television. So that's got to count for something.
And he also inspired, like, he also gave us like the copycat Seagals. Do you remember that?
Who were the copycats?
Jeff Speakman. Remember Jeff Speakman?
Oh,
The Perfect Weapon?
And they were. I forgot about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was
Arnold
amazing.
Schwarzenegger. My dad loved Bronson. Bronson was probably his favorite of all these guys. He just thought Bronson in the 60s and 70s just delivered the goods every time. He followed him all the way through to 10 to Silence and Murphy's Law and all those good ones. I don't know why he just kind of became the Death Wish guy. It feels like he should have been slightly more than that. A couple people theorized that it was because he looked slightly Asian. And just at that time in America, that was like this weird handicap for him. I don't know if I buy that. What do you think the reason that Bronson never became kind of the A-list guy?
He had no range. I mean, he couldn't do anything else.
All right, well, that's a good reason.
That's part of it. I mean, he just didn't have a lot to do beyond those revenge movies. I don't think it was racial. I mean, I think that he didn't look like anybody else, but I mean, I think that the thing that he was doing in movies was a perfectly palatable thing. And he didn't come from a group of people. He wasn't a black actor. I mean, a black actor would never have been able to get away with doing any of that stuff in movies. You know, I mean, it would never have worked. You know, I mean, his background.
The racial thing to me was I don't agree with it, but it was interesting just because of that era and the fact that Bruce Lee, you know, I think that definitely played a factor in the fact that his movies weren't bigger in America than they should have been. And then just the lack of, you know, the fact that blaxploitation was just in this little tiny corner, and Carl Weathers was basically the Jackie Robinson of action movies for black action stars, but with Action Jackson, which didn't come out until 1989. there definitely was a weird racial component to action heroes, which is a little perplexing looking back.
Well, I mean, what's interesting to me is that the thing that Carl Weathers was the hope that people had for Action Jackson in terms of launching some other career, some new thing for black action stars, which, I mean, did not happen, but probably would have happened without Action Jackson, which wasn't even that big a hit. I mean, there were other people sort of doing similar things. I think Action Jackson was just a very high-profile version of it. But you had things like, I mean, you had guys like Jim Brown and the Richardson, whose first name is totally escaping me, Frank Richardson or Fred Williamson.
Fred Williamson?
Yeah, I mean, you had those guys who were really, I mean, they weren't as popular as the Charles Bronsons and the Clint Eastwoods, but they were also not relegated to blaxploitation movies. And I think that at some point what you get is this really interesting thing where the studios began to split the difference and have black sidekicks. So Chuck Norris he'd be working with black people, or alongside them.
Right.
And, you could find a way to have a black guy in the action movie who, stereotypically was the jive guy, was the guy who knew he was too good to be, caught up in all the craziness, but yet was caught up in all the craziness because, the Yaphet Kotto in Alien or in Alien, he wasn't the jive guy, but I mean, that's a bad example, actually. I'm thinking of Yaphet Kotto in some other thing. But I mean, that's a type of character now. And I mean, Anthony Mackie is currently playing it in Iron Man in Captain America, the new Captain America movie is Falcon. I mean, there are just so many variations on that where it's like the studio sort of saying, look, we can't make this guy the star of the movie, but we'll definitely give him a lot of play alongside the sort of more traditional white hero.
Yaphet Kotto, you were thinking of The Running Man. That was when he played that guy.
That's maybe what I was. Yeah, I mean, alongside Schwarzenegger, sure.
Right, but that was a stretch of 15 years where if you saw the black guy in the action movie, it was just a question of when he was dying. And that went all the way through to even in Daylight with Sly Stallone in 96, when Stan Shaw was like the good guy who's just trying to get back to see his Jamaican fiancée who has a terrible accent. And you're like, Stan Shaw's not making it. So somehow he is dying. And then he died. But then eventually in the 2000s, that flipped. But it is interesting that I did that belt, and I think Denzel was the first black actor who held the belt, and it wasn't until 2004. We have not seen the ass-kicking whatever. It just never happened for whatever reason. I don't think like Jamie Foxx, that could have been like nobody would have bought him in that corner, right?
No, and I think that it's interesting because I don't think Jamie Foxx would have wanted to do it, and I think the interesting thing about Denzel is that I don't even believe that he wanted to do those sorts of parts, but I mean, he wound up doing them because it was easy for studios to give a black actor a cop role or a detective role because they're sort of race agnostic, right? Like you can cast anybody as a cop,
yes,
and pat yourself on the back for doing it because you don't have to rewrite very much. And so he actually, I think Virtuosity was, as far off the top of my head, the first sort of throwaway action movie that he made, and his nemesis in that movie was Russell Crowe, who was really, 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 really appealing in that movie.
That was when he became a star, I think.
Yeah, that was the beginning. I think that what came after?
Yeah.
What came right after Virtuosity? I can't remember now, but I mean, Russell Crowe did something else. I think L.A. Confidential was not too far after Virtuosity. And I
remember Virtuosity put him on the map.
Yeah. I didn't know who he was before that movie. I mean, he made that movie called The Sum of Us, but I hadn't seen that before that. And I don't think it actually officially got a serious release until after Virtuosity. I could be wrong about that because of how video works, but I mean, he was really good in a movie as a gay guy, dealing with his father, in an Australian movie called Some of Us, but that didn't make him a star at all. It was Virtuosity that kind of put him on the map, and then LA Confidential happened. But it's really
good
interesting
segue,
to think
by the
about
way.
like who gets to become an action star and who doesn't.
Good segue. Hey, we've had all kinds of action heroes of all ethnic types, all racial types, all everything types. We've not had a gay action movie star yet, or somebody who played a gay action movie hero. It's 2014. This has gone into all types of movie and TV, and yet not in this genre. Would it work? Who could do it? How long do you think it like, could we have a gay James Bond?
Isn't James Bond already kind of gay? I mean, did you not see the last one with Javier Bardem? I mean, that was some of the most intense. It was like, that was almost hot, what went on between him and Daniel Craig in that movie. I mean, I think that this version of James Bond, the Daniel Craig era of James Bond, I think he actually, I mean, the great thing about that last movie is that it more or less declares him bisexual. I mean, he'll never do it in a movie, but I mean, he seemed extremely comfortable with the implication of bisexuality in that movie.
Well, I remember seeing Casino Royale and feeling like they were taking Bond in another direction. They just weren't ready to fully commit to it yet.
Yes.
They were kind of laying the groundwork for maybe some sort of late preference switch in Bond's life later on in his 50s. I do think it would be an interesting move for somebody to say, we're going to be the ones that makes a big budget action movie here with whoever. And that's kind of going to be our hook for the movie in some way. The response would be interesting. They get a lot of publicity for it. And if it was a good movie and it worked, it'd probably make some money, I'm guessing.
But what would be the point of having, I mean, obviously I'm on board with this, but I also sort of wonder, like, what does I feel like the questions that I'm asking are like, what would make this guy or this woman, if it's a woman, what would make them gay and what would make their gayness, like, how gay would they have to be? Like, or how, I mean, because there's some action stars who have no sexuality whatsoever. I mean, Schwarzenegger his appeal was never his sexuality. I mean, Bruce Willis, I argue to you, was sexy in those Die Hard movies. And I think the first Die Hard movie really worked as well as it did, as a hook because Willis really seemed to love his wife. And, there was an attraction between them, even though they had, almost 10 scenes together. This sort of sexiness and sex and action heroism, there's not a lot of overlap in those things. You can have sexy action stars, but, not a lot of those guys had a lot of sex. I mean, they did, some of them, but the sex really was the violence in a lot of ways. So I wonder how
Chuck Norris,
did he do it a lot?
I was going to say Chuck Norris. They would always throw boobs in his movies because it was kind of one trick to liven up Chuck Norris, who was the worst actor of all of these guys, even worse than Van Damme. So I was like, well, maybe if somebody takes their shirt off, at least Chuck will have a little bit of a kick to his step. But yeah, I think you're right in this sense that a lot of these guys, it really wasn't a big part of it. I was thinking, you mentioned how Arnold very rarely got down in these movies, and yet in his personal life was getting down constantly. It's kind of amazing that he never blended the two worlds and made it like just some horny action hero. I guess he was too smart to do that, but
he was too smart, and I don't think people would have wanted to see it.
Yeah, probably not. Speaking of Arnold, I always thought in my head it was Arnold and Sly together, like Bird and Magic. You just think of the decade and they're a combo and they were equally great and one wasn't really better than the other and they were just kind of both winners. But when you go back and you really look at the movies, it's a rout. Arnold from 82 to 94 just destroys Stallone. It's not close. I mean, if you say, what are the 10 best movies these two guys made combined, action-wise, Arnold probably has 8 of the 10. Did you ever think about that? Like Arnold really kind of kicked Sly's ass during that stretch. I never realized it.
I think that Arnold was in a much better position to do that because he had no self-regard. And I think that Stallone's Achilles heel as a star to me was always that he wanted to do everything. Do you know what I mean? And it wasn't so much that he wanted to do everything acting-wise. I think he wanted to do everything production-wise. So, I mean, he was directing movies. He was writing the movies. I think he really never believed that he was just some guy who shot people up and beat people up and that he was this tough juice head. I mean, I really don't think he thought that of himself. I think he really thinks, or in his prime, I think he really thought he was an artist. And I think he thought he had a real understanding of what audiences wanted and how to give it to them. And I also think he was the only person capable of giving it to them in the particular way that he did. And I think he just had I'm not sure what parts he turned down. I don't know if there's some great role that he turned down that went to, William Hurt. But I think
right.
that the reason I think he suffered as much as he did was because he chose parts that were so outlandish. He wasn't going for franchise. He was really going for he had an egotism that's just different from Schwarzenegger's. I think Schwarzenegger he wanted to work with the best directors. I think Stallone thought he was the best director. Do you know what I mean? Or I think he didn't want to work with a director who would sort of outshine him in the way that a James Cameron might. And I also don't know that Stallone's reputation was all that good. I mean, I think there are a lot of factors that sort of contribute to the movies he wound up making. And I just think that, but to his credit, he had a sense of humor. I mean, I think Rhinestone is a really bad movie, but it's got something, and he's a star in that movie. He and Dolly Parton have something. And I think that the thing that they have, the chemistry they have, I think is a real testament to Stallone's belief in himself. I think that he really he doesn't see himself the way we see him. And I think that every once in a while that his perception of himself and our perception of him meets up in a really interesting way. Unfortunately, that for him, the place that those two things met up best, I think, were the Rambo movies and the Rocky movies, obviously. But after Rocky, he made all those Rocky movies in the 80s. I think that the Rocky character and the Rambo character, I think we just believed him as that. We couldn't believe him as the kind of gangsters that he was playing in a movie like Oscar, which is a comedy that really relied on his verbal wit and dexterity. We just don't believe that about Stallone. And I think there's a way in which he is forcing himself to believe that about him. Rambo, Rocky, those things come really naturally to him, I think. Much more naturally, I think, than just playing comedy that doesn't end in somebody being hit over the head with a trash can.
Well, you make a great point about Stallone. This is probably my favorite thing about Stallone. Stallone does think he's an artist. And, a movie like First Blood, I thought First Blood was a really good movie. If you compare it to the other Vietnam War guilt movies from, going from 75 all the way through 86, it's really one of the better ones. And it has action scenes in it, but it's really a movie about a guy struggling to readjust to America after the war and not being able to fit in.
Coming out
and then
now?
You look at, in what sense?
Can you imagine Channing Tatum starring in First Blood?
Yeah, coming back from Iraq. Well, no, because everybody's on the side of the war veterans now, and the Vietnam War was different, right? There was this weird. People were protesting the war, and then these guys were coming back from it, and they, as Stallone said, people were spitting on him at the airport. But So he made that movie, and then the next year he directed Staying Alive with Travolta, which is hilarious for a variety of reasons. And then he tried to make the Cold War statement with Rocky IV. And it is this 4-year vortex of Stallone being like, I could make a difference. I'm Sly Stallone. I could do stuff. I'm going to save the Saturday Night Fever franchise, and I'm going to make a statement about the Cold War. And then eventually he realized, like, oh, yeah, I should just blow people up. That's probably a better idea. Quickly, I mentioned some Liam Neeson once he gives up the belt, which might not be for 2 years, some possible candidates to maybe take the reins. A lot of people thought I was underrating The Rock a little bit. I feel like I properly rated his potential. He's had a lot of swings now. He's been making 10 years of movies here, and really the best he's been has been in the last two Fast 5 and Fast 6, which he was a supporting guy in. We haven't seen that he can really carry an action movie in an old school way. I guess the closest he came was Walking Tall. Your thoughts on The Rock?
I think the wrestling is hurting him. He needs to get away from professional wrestling if this movie thing is really, really going to work. I think that there are people in the film industry who don't know why he's still I mean, it's a tough thing. I mean, because it is the thing that sort of made him famous, and I don't think he wants to give it up. But I know for me, I'm torn because I love him. I love him in the movies. I love him in the movies. I think he's got great presence. I think he's funny. I don't really like seeing him just there as a pure physical specimen. And I think that he's sort of been backed into accepting the thing that he never wanted to be as a movie star, which is, a big musclehead. And I think there was a period where he was really close to getting away from that. He made Southland Tales, which is a movie nobody saw, but is actually really interesting, and he's interesting in it. I mean, all the way, I would say from Southland Tales up through, I think the Rundown, I think he's really good in. I mean, he's really good. He's a really good straight man who still gets a laugh. I think as an action star, the problem is you just don't, it just doesn't look that hard for him. And you see him in something like Snitch, which I think goes in the action thriller category and is like the most Stallone movie that Stallone never made. And he's actually giving a performance in that film that I think is really interesting. But I think as long as he's in any way associated.
I was just going to say, I just saw Snitch, which I hadn't seen when I wrote this column. I literally just saw it on Monday. And he's really good in it. And it's not a typical action movie. And it is kind of like a Stallone late 80s part.
Yeah.
And it was the kind of role that I wasn't sure that he could play. And it made me think if he's just making bad picks.
Well, these movies aren't hits. So, I mean, there is that. I mean, there is also a sense, I think, it's not just whether I think the movies are good or bad. It's also that they're not making any money. And you would have thought that, like, him and Michael Bay and Mark Wahlberg would have been a slam dunk. But it wasn't. And I think that, this is a sort of parenthetical thing because Mark Wahlberg is definitely somebody who, I mean, you mention him, and he was never close to having a belt, but he also was somebody who had the luxury of not being an action star, which is a really important point in all of this. A lot of the guys who wind up being action stars have no other option. They can't do anything else. And I think they have seized on their best asset, and they've tried to make it work for them. I mean, there's a universe in which, Bill, I think you might really recall this. We almost had a Brian Bosworth action star.
Oh, I should have put that in the column. I blocked that out of my mind.
I mean, that almost happened because he had, like, it was a possible, I mean, it was something that if he had clicked with and he'd been good at, the public would have gone with it. And I think that there's a way in which, Wahlberg's in a really tricky position, and I think The Rock is in a really tricky position because, I mean, The Rock is also sort of crippled. Wahlberg is in a tricky position because I think that he is just doing too much of too many different things. And I think if he wants to sort of do dramatic stuff, he should keep doing that. but he doesn't have what Denzel has, and you saw that in that movie they made together that came out last summer, which you hated and I kind of liked. And now I can't even remember what it was called.
Two Guns.
Two Guns, yeah. I think that he just isn't. He can only be in a movie. I mean, he can do a lot, but I think his being in this Transformers movie is really distressing me, and I can't put my finger on why. I think the idea that he was in a franchise that used to be carried by Shia LaBeouf is a problem. I think that I don't know what his sort of. I think Michael Bay has also directed this one. I don't know what's going on with them. He's given up David O. Russell and has embraced this, the opposite of David O. Russell. And I think with The Rock, I feel like the fact that I am sort of going between calling him Dwayne Johnson and The Rock is a huge problem. It just is like I don't know which brand. Yeah. I don't know which brand to do anything with, and I think that he has not really come down on either side of the name thing. And I think the name thing is really indicative of his own sort of professional dilemma. Like, what does he want to be at this point? Because he can still choose. There's time.
This sounds like a good column for you. Just file this one away. I like the thought of the two Dwayne Johnsons and the whole wrestling thing. Because I agree with you. The wrestling thing to me is like if Clooney had just never left ER and it just done 15 seasons of ER while he was also making movies. It's like, just leave ER already. Just leave. You're done. You graduated. You don't need to wrestle anymore. Quickly, let's talk about give me your quick thoughts here because we got to go. Tom Hardy, too high. His potential is too high as an actor, I feel like, to just be an action star. You agree?
Oh, God. I mean, this is going to sound crazy to say, but I don't think the movies know what to do with Tom Hardy. I don't think he wants to be the thing that the movies want to make him, or Hollywood anyway. I think he wants to act. And so I think he's going to keep getting these parts where...
Where what?
Oh, well, basically he's going to keep getting these parts where, you know, he's going to be expected to be this kind of brute. He's going to be expected to be this kind of like, you know, tough guy who doesn't really say a lot but beats the hell out of people. I just don't. I mean, he's a really good actor, and I think he'd like to act. And I think that his like the way he looks. I mean, he's got this very sort of scowly expression. I mean, he's a sexy person, and I think that he could play it a number of different ways. I'm curious to see where it goes. I kind of like him in ensembles. I don't think he necessarily is a star. I watched him with Chris Pine and Reese Witherspoon in that really, really terrible movie where the two of them were like, you know, basically wasting taxpayer dollars to win her over, and make her choose one. I just didn't feel any. I mean, granted, like you can't get too worked up as an actor over a part like this, but I mean, it also didn't lead to anything else, and I wonder what he really does. I mean, I like him a lot, but I mean, do you like him?
I like him. I agree with you that it seems like he wants to be an actor. The Reese Witherspoon movie was a first-rate travesty, and really could have realistically ended all three of their careers.
It could have. You're right.
Yeah, we'll see. Warrior though that I don't know. I'm keeping my eye on him. I also thought he was getting Bane. I mean, he's hiding behind as Bane. He's hiding behind all that armor and the mask, obviously. But it was a great performance. I think he might actually be overqualified to be an action hero. The guy that I put this in the column, Jason Momoa, who was from Game of Thrones and was really, really terrific in Bullet to the Head. He's somebody that really seems like he could fit the Seagal, Van Damme, Chuck Norris, like just those low budget action things. And, you know, Rafe made this point. I didn't put it in the column because I don't know why I didn't put it in the column actually, but Rafe was saying that HBO and Cinemax and Showtime have really kind of blown it because they could own that Chuck Norris Seagal corner. They could make those movies, you know, and make that like a recurring, like this is like we're trying to bring back the low budget action franchise. And what's weird is that instead of them, it seems like the WWE has tried to do that with these different John Cena movies and all the other weird movies that they've made. But I like him a lot. What do you think of him?
Okay, first of all, I have two feelings. Thing number one is, are you Jason Momoa is really interesting. I think he might be more Stallone than he is like anybody else. I think he directs. I think he has a sort of regard for himself as being more than a like handsome guy who can beat people up because he's big and strong, right? He's on a Sundance Channel show right now. That I don't know if anybody's watching it, but I mean it's the sort of slow burning cop action show that, you know, would have been a Chuck Norris movie in 1982. But to your other point about what these cable channels could be doing, I would say two things. I'd say one, you have justified with Timothy Olyphant doing, you know, that thing on FX. And I don't know if you're watching this show, Bill, and I'm going to tell you right now that if you're not watching it, you should be. It's called Banshee, and it's on Cinemax.
Can I guess?
Have you seen this?
Oh, I was going to say Banshee. Everyone tells me to watch Banshee.
Oh, my God. I can't believe we are wasting 10 seconds talking about True Detective and not spending any time talking about Banshee, which is an incredible expletive show. I mean, the action sequences on this show are... I've never seen anything like this in the movies that Michael Bay or John Frankenheimer didn't actually do. I mean, the opening sequence or the second sequence in the first episode of this show is incredible. The fifth episode has a fight that is more incredible than any fight I've seen in almost any movie. I was watching it alone in my house, and I stood up and I clapped. Is how good it was. I mean,
wow.
the action in this show, I mean, and we haven't even talked about how good the action is in Asia. I mean, that's a whole other right. universe of just astoundingly talented stunt choreography, and stunt choreographers and action stars. But I mean, Banshee is on Cinemax, and it is, it's tough. Do you want to get Cinemax to watch the show? I would say it's worth every penny you'd pay for like the month it would take you to get through the two seasons. The second season just ended. Rafe
loves Banshee too. Yeah, Rafe loves it too, and I now need to watch it because two people I respect for their action choices both love the show. Last question, then we got to go. Channing Tatum, overqualified to be an action hero? Properly qualified? Or does he go the rom-com route? What do you see from him?
I like Channing Tatum. I think he can do anything. I don't think he's really... I think he was another person who, as we were talking about before, I don't think he knew what he could do, and I think he got lucky. I mean, not like... he really did get lucky. I mean, talk about a break. He really could have been G.I. Joe for the rest of his career, you know? And I think he's so handsome that I think it would have been easy for him to sort of listen to producers who told him, you know, you can just be hot and that'll be okay. And, you know, that's enough for you. But I think he is somebody who really believes in himself, not really in a Stallone way where it's delusional. I think he actually is a talented actor. And I think that he's really funny, and I think that he gets the joke. I think he can get another director's joke, but I think he gets the joke that we are like eager to tell about him, and he gets to the joke before we do. And I think that is a really important thing that's going to keep him working way beyond other guys his age. He's not the greatest actor, but he doesn't have to be because he's a good enough actor and a good enough star who makes really good choices, and actually is kind of smart, both about what he does and about the way he does it. I don't think he needs to this is the thing we were talking about. Like, I think with action stars, it's something you wind up doing because you can't do anything else, and you just happen to be really good at that sort of thing. It's why you've disqualified all these other actors who've kicked people in the head in their movies. And I think Channing Tatum can do more than that.
Yeah, he's probably overqualified. Although I did throw him out for to replace Paul Walker in Fast 8. And some people were saying that that's people, it's Fast 7's going to come out. Paul Walker's going to be in it. And then we're going to have to think about, who gets that role. And if the Fast movies keep going and going and going, they're going to go big for the Paul Walker replacement. And it's going to be somebody like him. It could be, I even feel like if they got Taylor Kitsch or somebody like that, I don't even know if that name is big enough. I think they'd be thinking big. I think they'd be thinking somebody like Channing Tatum.
But, I mean, if you're
Wesley,
Channing Tatum, would you do it?
I think I would. I mean, I think it would be an easy job. And it's kind of the move for Fast and Furious for that franchise to keep going is you make everybody around Vin Diesel bigger and bigger and bigger. And it becomes, each movie has their own. They didn't this time around. I think they added Kurt Russell and somebody else is the bad guy who was famous. I can't remember, but I think that's going to be their move going forward is just to blow it out each time with actors.
Yeah, interesting.
Wesley, this was really fun.
I had a great time.
Thank you for your action era thoughts. I'm sorry for the 2-second delay. It only got weird a couple times. Last thing though, before you go, are you using stamps.com?
I'm not, but I should be because I was in the last post office the other day and it sucked.
Yeah, well, it's so easy to use. All you have to do is go to stamps.com. You put in the little BS where the microphone is, and you can sign up. You get a bonus offer you get free postage, you get a digital scale. It's a no-risk trial. You can back out after 4 weeks if you don't like it. But the good news is it's a personal post office. You don't have to wait in line at the post office anymore, Wesley. And frankly, it bothers me that you wait in line at the post office. Only people from the 1990s wait in the post office. The cutting-edge people, they use stamps.com, and they print out their postage from their house. Anyway, I think you should try it. Stamps.com. Sponsor BS Report for a long time. Wesley Morris, what'd you write about this week?
Noah.
Oh.
Yeah, Noah Cesar Chavez.
I look forward to reading that.
Yeah. I mean, I can't say I loved it, but it's there.
I think it's funny that you didn't write about the Schwarzenegger movie because they didn't screen it because it's a Schwarzenegger movie and he should stop making action movies at this point. But that brings us full circle. Wesley Morris, a pleasure. Sorry for the 2-second delay. Everybody else, enjoy the weekend, and we will see you on the BS Report next week. Baseball preview. We will be calling Jacko until then.
Target % off. Whoa.
Thank you for downloading the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Too much fun.
Check out more podcasts at the iTunes Music Store or at Podcenter at ESPNradio.com.
Peace out.
Gotta say, Golick, great call on grabbing Subway for lunch and getting guacamole on our subs.
Told you this new guac really amps up the flavor.
Yep, something adding up things can be great. Guacamole on your sub, a new co-host to replace you.
What was that?
Oh, no, nothing.
Subway now has deliciously rich new guacamole made from ripe Hass avocados with just a hint of garlic, onion, and jalapeno. Discover how new guacamole turns up the flavor on any of your freshly made favorites. Subway, eat fresh.